The first time Kim Soo-jin saw the enemy soldier, he was bleeding on the floor of a makeshift hospital in Seoul. It was July 1950, and the city burned under the advance of North Korean troops. She had been a nurse in the South Korean army for only 3 weeks, and her hands still trembled when changing dressings. The man before her wore a different uniform than she was used to seeing. Dark olive green, torn at the shoulder, stained with dirt and blood. His eyes were closed, his face pale as rice paper. For an instant, Soo-jin hesitated. He was the enemy. This man had crossed the 38th parallel to destroy everything she knew. But when he moaned softly, she knelt beside him and began to work. In the following days, Soo-jin discovered his name was Park Min-ho. He was 24 years old, only 2 years older than her. He came from a village near Pyongyang and spoke with an accent she could barely understand at first. Min-ho had been wounded during a firefight and separated from his unit. When he woke up in the hospital, surrounded by South Korean soldiers, he didn't try to escape. He just looked at Soo-jin with an expression she couldn't decipher. Fear, perhaps, or something deeper than that. He didn't seem like a monster. He just seemed tired. Soo-jin should have hated him. Her older brother had died in the first week of the invasion, fighting in the streets of Seoul. Her mother cried every night in the basement where they hid from the bombing. But when she changed Min-ho's dressings and saw the old scar on his ribs, or the way he whispered "thank you" so low it could barely be heard, something inside her wavered. He had a laborer's hands, calloused and rough, and when his fingers touched hers by accident while she adjusted the bandage, Soo-jin felt a strange warmth travel up her arm. Min-ho began to improve. He didn't speak much, but observed everything around him with silent attention. Sometimes when Soo-jin passed between the beds, she felt his gaze on her. One afternoon, while checking his temperature, he asked her name. She hesitated before answering. "Soo-jin," she finally said, and he repeated it slowly, as if memorizing the pronunciation. "It's a beautiful name," he murmured. She felt her face flush and turned quickly to attend another patient. The weeks dragged on. The war gave no respite. The hospital received wounded every day. South Korean soldiers, civilians, even some captured North Koreans like Min-ho. Soo-jin worked until she was exhausted, sleeping only a few hours a night on a thin mattress on the floor. Min-ho recovered enough strength to sit up, then to walk around the hospital with difficulty. Guards watched him, but he never tried to escape. Instead, he began to help where he could, holding basins, carrying water, translating for other North Korean prisoners who arrived wounded and confused. One night, during a particularly violent bombing, the hospital lights failed. Soo-jin was in the middle of a suture when everything went dark. She heard screams, the sound of metal falling, the distant whistle of bombs. Her hands froze. Suddenly, she felt someone beside her. It was Min-ho, holding a flickering lantern. "Continue," he said softly. "I'll hold the light." She looked at him, and for a moment, she forgot there was a war happening outside. She finished the suture under the weak light he held, their faces so close she could hear his breathing. After that night, something changed between them. Whispered conversations when no one was paying attention. Glances that lasted a second longer than they should. Min-ho told her about his family, his fisherman father, his younger sister who loved to draw, his mother who made the best kimchi in the village. Soo-jin spoke about her brother, about how he used to make paper figures for her when they were children, about the pain his death had left. Min-ho listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. "I didn't want to be here," Min-ho admitted one night, his voice hoarse. "I don't believe in this war, but I had no choice. They took all the men from my village. They said we were needed to liberate the South." He laughed bitterly. "Liberate from what? The people here seem just as scared as us." Soo-jin felt a knot in her throat. "My brother had no choice either. He was 19. He had barely begun to live." They fell silent, sharing the weight of everything they had lost. Autumn arrived with cold winds. UN troops began pushing North Korean forces back. The hospital was preparing to move further north, following the advance. Min-ho would be transferred to a prisoner of war camp. When Soo-jin learned the news, she felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She knew this day would come, but she wasn't prepared for the sharp pain that pierced her chest. That night, she went to the corner where Min-ho slept. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question. Minho sat up slowly. "Yes." His voice was so low she could barely hear it. "Soo-jin, He stopped, searching for the right words. "I shouldn't feel this. You should hate me." She knelt beside him and for the first time, allowed herself to touch his face. His skin was warm under her fingers. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to hate you, but I can't." He covered her hand with his, pressing it against his face as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "If things were different," Minho murmured, "if there wasn't this war, this border between us, I would have asked you to marry me. I would have worked hard, built a house for you, given you the life you deserve." Tears burned in Soo-jin's eyes. "And I would have said yes," she replied, without hesitation. They stayed like that for a long moment, clinging to each other while the world crumbled around them. Minho leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her eyelids, and finally her lips. It was a desperate kiss, full of everything they couldn't say, of all the futures they would never have. The next morning, when the trucks came to take the prisoners, Soo-jin stood at the hospital entrance. Minho passed her with his hands tied, surrounded by guards. Their eyes met for one last second. He didn't smile, but there was a silent promise in his gaze. "I will remember you." Then he disappeared inside the truck, and Soo-jin stood there, alone, with the taste of salt on her lips and an emptiness in her chest that nothing could fill. The months that followed were the hardest of Soo-jin's life. The war continued, brutal and relentless. She threw herself into work, caring for the wounded until her hands bled and her mind went numb. At night, lying on her thin mattress, she thought of Minho. Where was he? Was he alive? Was he thinking of her too? She had no answers, only a constant fear that gnawed at her insides. In 1951, the battle line stabilized near the 38th parallel. Armistice negotiations began, but the fighting continued. Soo-jin was transferred to a hospital closer to the demilitarized zone. The work was relentless, but she didn't care. Physical pain was easier to bear than emotional pain. Sometimes, when treating North Korean prisoners, she questioned them discreetly, looking for any news about Park Min-ho from Pyongyang. No one knew anything. A letter arrived in February 1952. It was from her mother, telling her they had rebuilt part of the house in Seoul. Her younger sister had gotten married. Life was trying to continue despite the war. Soo-jin folded the letter carefully and kept it with her only family photo. That night, she cried for the first time in months. Not just for Minho, but for everything she had lost. Her innocence, her youth, the version of herself that believed in happy endings. The spring of 1953 brought rumors that an armistice was near. Negotiations were slowly advancing. Soldiers talked about going home, about rebuilding lives. Soo-jin didn't share their optimism. Even if the war ended, she and Minho were on opposite sides of a border that seemed insurmountable. She had accepted she would never see him again. This acceptance hurt more than any physical wound she could suffer. In July 1953, the armistice agreement was finally signed. The news spread through the hospital like wildfire. Soldiers shouted, embraced each other, cried with relief. Soo-jin sat quietly outside, looking at the mountains to the north. The war had ended, but her heart remained divided. She imagined Minho somewhere beyond that border, alive or dead, remembering her or trying to forget. The pain was so intense she doubled over, hugging her knees to her chest. The following weeks were chaotic. Prisoners of war were exchanged. Separated families tried to reconnect through the Red Cross. Soo-jin returned to Seoul, to the rebuilt house where her mother and sister waited for her. It was strange to be back. The city was familiar, yet completely different. Bomb scars marked the streets. New buildings grew beside ruins. She tried to start over, work in a civilian hospital, resume some semblance of normalcy. But at night, lying in her room, she still thought of Minho. 3 months after the armistice, in October 1953, Soo-jin was returning from the market when she saw a figure standing on the corner of her street. It was a tall man, too thin, wearing worn civilian clothes. He was looking at the houses as if searching for something. Sujin continued walking, distracted by her own thoughts. Then the man turned and the world stopped. It was Minho. He was thinner, his face marked by lines that weren't there before. But they were the same eyes, dark, intense, full of everything she had tried to forget. For a moment, neither of them moved. The shopping bag slipped from Sujin's hands and fell to the ground. Cabbages and potatoes rolled across the sidewalk. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at him. Minho took a step forward, then another. His hands trembled. "Sujin," he said, and his voice broke in the middle of her name. "I looked for you. All these months I looked." She ran. She didn't think, just ran, and he caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground while she clung to him as if he would disappear any second. He smelled of cheap soap and road dust, but it was him, really him, alive and here. "How?" she managed to ask, her face buried in his neck. "How are you here?" Minho set her back on the ground but didn't let go. "After the armistice, some of us were given permission to cross. Not many, but I had to try. I spent months navigating bureaucracy, bribing whoever needed to be bribed, proving I wasn't a threat. They finally gave me a temporary visa." He held her face in his hands. "I couldn't let you go. Not without at least trying." They stood there in the street, oblivious to the curious looks from neighbors. Sujin touched his face, his stubble, the new scar above his eyebrow. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "Every night I thought you were dead." Minho pressed his forehead against hers. "Every night I kept you alive in my mind. It was the only thing that made me keep going." Tears ran down Sujin's face, but this time they were tears of something she had forgotten how to feel: hope. In the following days, Minho told his story. The prisoner camp had been harsh, but he survived. After liberation, he returned to his village, only to discover his family had moved to Pyongyang looking for work. He found them, embraced his mother and sister, but knew he couldn't stay. His heart was in the south, with a nurse with sad eyes who had seen humanity in him when no one else did. The journey to cross the border was dangerous and expensive, but he was determined. Sujin took him to meet her mother. The older woman was suspicious at first. He was from the north, the enemy. But when she saw the way Minho looked at her daughter, something in her expression softened. "You made her smile again," she said simply. "That's enough." They had dinner together that night. A simple meal of rice and soup, but for Sujin, it was the most precious feast she had ever experienced. Minho's visa was temporary, only 6 months. But 6 months were better than nothing. They spent every day together, exploring Seoul, walking along the Han River, visiting temples where they lit incense and made silent prayers. Minho found work at a construction factory, saving every one he earned. Sujin continued working at the hospital, but now there was light in her steps, a reason to wake up every morning. They talked about the future with the caution of people who had learned that the future wasn't guaranteed. "What if I can't stay?" Minho asked one night as they walked hand in hand under the cherry blossoms. "What if they don't renew my visa?" Sujin squeezed his hand. "Then we'll find another way. I'm not losing you again, not after all this." There was a fierce determination in her voice that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real. Minho began the process to apply for permanent residence. It was complicated. He was a former North Korean soldier in a country still bleeding from recent wounds. But he had witnesses willing to speak for him. Sujin wrote letter after letter to the authorities, detailing how he had helped at the hospital, how he had proven his humanity. Other nurses and doctors also wrote, remembering the gentle prisoner who had held lanterns during bombings and translated for the wounded. Months passed. Summer gave way to autumn again. Minho's visa was about to expire when the news finally came. His application had been approved. He could stay. When he received the official document, his hands trembled so much he almost dropped it. Sujin was beside him, and when she saw the printed words, "Permanent residence granted," she cried out with joy and hugged him so tight he lost his balance. They married in a small ceremony in the winter of 1954. Soo-jin wore her mother's hanbok, light blue with delicate embroidery. Min-ho wore a simple suit he had bought with his savings. There weren't many guests: her mother and sister, some friends from the hospital, Min-ho's co-workers. But when he held her hands and promised to love her through all the storms life might bring, Soo-jin felt something settle inside her. Peace. Finally, peace. They rented a small apartment near the hospital where Soo-jin worked. It was modest, just 2 rooms, but it was theirs. Min-ho painted the walls white, fixed the broken window, built shelves with his own hands. Soo-jin sewed curtains and filled the space with small touches. A potted plant, a photo of them on their wedding day, a ceramic vase they had bought at a market. At night, they lay together on their futon, talking about the small details of the day, and Soo-jin thought about how she had almost given up believing moments like this were possible. Life wasn't perfect. Min-ho still faced prejudice. There were people who couldn't forget he had fought for the North. Finding consistent work was difficult. Soo-jin saw the frustration in his eyes when yet another employer rejected him, but he never complained. Instead, he worked wherever he could, took any job they offered, and every night came home to her. "As long as I have you," he said, "I have everything I need." Soo-jin became pregnant in the spring of 1955. When she told Min-ho, he stood still for a long moment, then picked her up in his arms and spun her until she laughed and begged him to stop. "A baby," he whispered, amazed. "Our baby." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "This child will grow up in a world at peace. She won't know war or hunger or fear." Tears glistened in his eyes. "We'll give her everything we didn't have." Their daughter was born in December, a small, noisy girl with Min-ho's eyes and Soo-jin's nose. They named her Jiwoo, the wisest, because she had been born from the wisdom that came from surviving the impossible. Min-ho held her as if she were made of porcelain, his face too large as he gazed at the child in his arms. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're perfect." And Soo-jin, exhausted but happy, knew that all the tears, all the fear, all the sleepless nights had been worth it for this moment. Years passed. Jiwoo grew into a curious girl who loved to draw, just like the aunt she would never meet in the North. Min-ho found stable work as a carpenter, building furniture that people praised for its quality. Soo-jin continued working at the hospital, now as a senior nurse, training younger generations. They saved enough to buy a larger apartment, then a small house in the suburbs. It was modest, but it had a garden where Jiwoo could play, and where Min-ho planted the same flowers his mother used to grow in Pyongyang. Sometimes, at night, after Jiwoo was asleep, Min-ho and Soo-jin sat in the garden and looked north. They knew Min-ho's family was there, on the other side of the border that remained closed and heavily guarded. He had tried to make contact through the Red Cross, but the letters never received responses. "Do you think they know?" Soo-jin would ask, holding his hand. "That you're alive and happy?" Min-ho squeezed her fingers. "I hope so. I hope my mother knows I found what she always wanted for me, a good life with someone I love." There were difficult moments, periods when money was tight, when Jiwoo got sick and they stayed up all night worried, when the weight of Min-ho's separation from his family in the North became too heavy. But they faced everything together. Soo-jin learned that love wasn't just the grand moments, the first kiss under the bombs, the reunion on the street 3 years later. It was also holding someone's hand during a hospital bill, cooking soup when he had a cold, listening to the same stories over and over because they made him smile. Min-ho aged well. His hair began to gray at the temples, wrinkles formed around his eyes. But he still looked at Soo-jin the same way he had looked at her in that hospital in 1950, with silent admiration, as if she were the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. "I would have crossed 1,000 borders for you," he told her on their 10th wedding anniversary. "Would have fought in 1,000 wars. You were the only thing that made all the suffering worthwhile." Soo-jin aged beside him, her hair darkening with silver threads, her skin marked by time and work. But when she looked at herself in the mirror, she still saw the young nurse who had knelt beside an enemy soldier and chosen compassion instead of hate. That choice had changed everything. It had given her a life she never could have imagined, a husband who loved her fiercely, a daughter who was her joy, a home built on the ashes of war. Jiwoo grew up hearing the story of how her parents met. She made them retell it repeatedly, fascinated by the idea of love blooming amid destruction. "You were like heroes from a book," she would say, wide-eyed. Minho always laughed. "We weren't heroes. We were just two scared people trying to find humanity in a world that had gone mad." But Soojin knew there was heroism in that, in the act of choosing to love when the world demanded hate, of building bridges when everyone around them built walls. Decades passed. South Korea rebuilt itself, became prosperous. The war became history, something school textbooks taught. But for Minho and Soojin, it was never just history. It was the foundation upon which they built their lives. They visited the site of the old hospital sometimes, now a modern office building. Minho would stand on the sidewalk, remembering the night he held a lantern so Soojin could finish a suture. "That's when I knew," he would say, "that you were who I had waited for all my life without knowing." On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by Jiwoo and their grandchildren, Minho held Soojin's hand under the table. His fingers were twisted by arthritis now, but his grip was firm. "Do you regret anything?" he asked quietly. Soojin looked around the room, her family, her home, the life they had built together brick by brick. "Not a single second," she replied. "I would choose you again, in every life, in every war, in every circumstance." And it was true, because the love they had found wasn't the romantic, easy kind from fairy tales. It was the kind that survived bombs and borders and prejudice and separation. It was the kind that deepened with every hardship faced, every obstacle overcome. It was the kind that proved that even in humanity's darkest moments, light could still find a way in. Minho leaned over and kissed her forehead, the same way he had done that first night in the hospital, and Soojin closed her eyes, grateful for every complicated and beautiful moment that had brought them here.